Welcome back. Today we'll be going over loops, an essential aspect of programming within Java. So let's create a new class and let's call it loops. And let's delete this unnecessary code and let's type in public static um, void main and then string and args, and then we'll write our code within here. So why are loops helpful? So they're helpful for two main reasons. So firstly, they reduce the amount of code that we need to write, as well as making it easier to follow. And then secondly, they help us transverse or go through data structures. So let me give you an example of what this actually means. So let's say you were inviting 50 people to a party. Instead of having to say, hello, welcome, you're invited to this party 50 times, you could just create a loop and it'll say a certain message for you 50 times because you want the for loop to run 50 times. So that's an example of how the for loop can be used to help make code shorter and also easier to read. Because if you had 50 lines of code just saying, hello, welcome, you're invited to this party, it would actually take a lot of manpower to actually read that code. But the for loop could be done within a couple lines and that's much easier to read. So let's look at an example. So to actually write the for loop, we write for, and then we have parentheses, and then in the first in the first part of the parentheses, we put the start condition. So I'll explain what that means later, but then we have the actual condition. So it will run, the for loop will run as long as this condition in the middle is met. And we talked about conditionals in the last video. So if you haven't seen that, check that one out. And then lastly, we have what we are iterating by. Iterating by. So let's say our starting condition is, oh, well, iterating by means just like what is changing by each time. So let's get an example going. So we have 4 and then int I is equal to 0. So our starting condition is that the integer variable I is equal to 0. And we can declare new variables here. And then our condition, let's say I is less than 5. And then let's say we add 1 to I each time. And that could be seen as either I plus plus or I plus equal 1. And let's say we wanted to do that I iterates by 2 each time. We do I plus equals 2, but let's just keep it simple and I plus plus. And then we have the curly brackets. And now what this is telling us is that as long as I is less than 5, then we'll execute whatever is in this code. So let's say, and let's actually go through what it would look like for each time. So I starts at 0, right? So it'll run it that one time. Then now we add 1 to I, so I becomes 1. Then now we run it because I 1 is less than 5. Then I becomes 2. Then it becomes 3. Then it becomes 4. So now after 4, we're going to add 1 to 4 to make it 5. But 5 is not less than 5. So the loop, the code that's within this loop right now, it won't run for the sixth time because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that means our loop will only run 5 times. And whatever code was within this for loop will run 5 times. So now let's get another example going. So let's say I is equal to 10 as long as I is greater than 5. And then we have I minus equals 2. So what this means is that each time we're going to be subtracting 2 from I, which in the starting case is 10. So 10 is greater than 5, so we're going to run it for that one time. So then we're going to subtract 2 and we get 8. And 8 is greater than 5, so we're going to run it for the second time. And we subtract 2 and we get 6. And 6 is greater than 5, so it will it will run for the third time. And then now if we subtract 2 one more time, we get 4. The 4 is not greater than 5, so it won't run for that fourth time. So now let's see if this is actually the output that we get. We can just do system.out.println and then I, and I is referring to the variable that we created up here, integers, and it should give us 10, 8, 6 if our logic is correct. And let's see. And it is correct. We get 10, 8, and 6. So that's another example. So now I have one more example for you guys. So let's say 10 I is equal to 50, as long as I is greater than 5, and we're going to do I is equal to I divided by 2. So what does that mean? That means each time I is going to divide itself by 2 as its iteration. So let's say our starting case in this case is 50, right? Now we're going to divide it by 2. What is 50 divided by 2? 25. 25 is greater than 5, obviously. So now we have 25 divided by 2, which is really 12.5. But remember that this variable is an integer, so 12.5 will automatically round down to 12. So our next run is 12. Is 12 greater than 5? It is. So now we're going to run it one more time, and it's going to be 6. Is 6 greater than 5? It is. So we run it one more time. But now the next time will be 3. But is 3 greater than 5? It's not. So we stop our loop there before the 3 can execute. So in reality, this loop will run 4 times. And if we run this code, it should give us this output as 50, 25, 12, and 6. And it does. So that's how we know our logic is correct for for loops. So now I actually have a challenge for you guys to make sure that you guys understand the concept of a for loop. So I want you to create a for loop with the initial condition that I is equal to 1. I is equal to 1. Then I want the condition to be that I is less than or equal to 100. And for each time, for the iteration, we want to multiply I by 2 each time. By 2 each time. So I encourage you to pause the video and then come up with your for loop and then come and check back to see your if your value is correct, if your for loop is correct. So let's see how we do this. So for, and then int I is equal to 1, because that's our initial condition. Then I has to be less than or equal to 100. And then each time we I is equal to I times 2. And then we have a for loop here. And let's just system dot out dot println I each time. So we see what our values can be. And let's comment out this piece of code here. And let's run our code. And yeah, that makes sense. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. 64 times 2 is 128, and that's obviously greater than 100, so that it won't run for that iteration. So that's how we do for loops within Java. So one additional thing that I talked about at the beginning is that for loops could be used to deal with data structures. So let's see an example of that. So first, let's just create an array with 100 numbers 0 through 99. So the way that we do that, remember, it's first it's the data type that we want. In this case, it's integer. Then we put empty brackets, and then we put the name. So that's our array. Set that as numbers, and then equals new, and then int, and then how many do we want? How many spaces? 100, and then enter. So we've created a new array with the 100 empty slots. So now let's use a for loop. So for int I is equal to 0, and let me explain this. So numbers, remember how we said that arrays start counting from 0, not 1? So it'll go from 0 to 99, all the indexes, because the indexes, they go to the length of the array minus 1. So let's just do numbers dot length, I plus plus. So in this case, it has 100, the length is 100, but I will have to be less than 100. So it'll only go up to 99, and that's our max index. So that's why we use for loops in that manner. And then let's create that numbers I, which the what we're doing here is we're using the numbers or the array's name, and then we're putting the index that we want to access or modify, and we're just going to set that to I. So what would that look like? That's going to look like 0. That's going to look like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 99. And now let's do something with conditionals. So let's say I want to make every odd number that we get equal to 0. Let's change every odd number equal to 0. So we're going to do for int I is equal to 0, I numbers dot length again, and then I plus plus. We're going to do if numbers I mod 2 is equal to 1. So what does that mean? So our mod operator is basically giving us the remainder. And if you divide any number by 2 and the remainder is 1, that means that number has to be odd. So we're checking in this on this block of code if the number is odd, and we're just going to set that number at equal to 0 if that's the case. So now let's run our code. And the way that we actually run our code is we can't print out numbers directly. We have to actually use a for loop in order to print or access every element inside the array. So let's do that. Int I is equal to 0, I less than numbers dot length. This pattern should seem very familiar by now because we're just using this is almost universally used to transverse through a whole array. Sure, there can be modifications to it. For instance, if you don't want to go through every one, you just want to go through um, even, every even index, you just do +2 instead of +1. But this is how we get through the whole list or the whole array. So let's just print our system dot out dot println I, and let's see if the code did what we wanted it to do, which is make every odd number equal to 0. And as we can see, it did not do that. So let's go back and debug our code. So if it's equal to 1, uh, if numbers dot length I plus plus, oh, here, we'd have to put numbers I, and now it should work. And as we can see, every odd number is turned to 0. So that's how we use for loops within Java for data structures as well. And there's just one more thing that I want to talk about. It's another form of a loop within Java. It's called a while loop. So basically a while loop, it it does something until a condition is false. So let's say I said while it's sunny outside, I won't go outside. So as soon as it stops being super sunny and super hot outside, then I'll go outside. So it's the same concept within programming. So while, and then here, condition here, we're gonna run that, and then we have our code here. It's gonna run this code as long as this condition is true. So let's get an example. And it's actually very important that this condition is actually reachable or it will come to a stop at one point because then it'll just run forever. Like if I say 1 is equal to 1, 1 is always going to be equal to 1. So the while loop is going to run forever. And I've had programs crash before in the past because the while loop just runs forever and ever and ever. So let's say um while number is less than 5 and we're going to print it's less than 5. System.out.println, and we're just going to print out number. And let's comment out all these pieces of code really quickly. Uh, yeah, so let's create an integer called number, and let's set it equal to 0. If I just run this now, it would run on forever because it would just repeat 0 over and over and over again because 0 is always going to be less than 5. So let's do number plus equals 1. And that just means number, it'll add number to 1 each time. So now let's run our code and see what happens. And as you can see, it will run 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it won't run 5 because 5 is not less than 5. So those are for loops and loops within Java. And I hope you learned something new today. And remember, the main reason why we use for loops is to help reduce our code and to make it easier to read. So thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something new.